Good evening and welcome again on this, the eve of Thomas Sunday. And I think we'll go back now to a little bit about the Old Testament is about you. And I think tomorrow we'll say something about Thomas, of course, in the sermon, and put that on also because certain aspects of the story about Thomas are perhaps about us as well. But I seem to recall that we stopped on the Old Testament is about you with Ahab and Jezebel. So I want to just recap a little that Ahab, largely under Jezebel's influence, had started to restore the worship of Baal throughout the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. And this became quite powerful, quite dominant. Now, if you'll recall, in Molech and Baal, especially Molech, but also in many of the temples of Baal, they often sacrificed babies or small children. And this was one of the particularly onerous parts of that kind of worship. Of course, temple prostitutes were common in all of them, and you would have male and female temple prostitutes. But the sacrifices, the human sacrifices, were always somehow associated with these cultures. Jezebel was, of course, she wasn't a Hebrew. She was from people for whom Baal worship was standard. Some discussion of whether she was a Canaanite or a Philistine, but anyway, she had led her husband to reintroduce this worship into these parts of the Holy Land. And we would have to think that Ahab had not resisted too strongly. And this helped to cement the split between Judea and Israel, the northern kingdom, and the southern kingdom. And this great division in the holy nation, in the Hebrew culture and society, was destined to be a great catastrophe, as we'll see a little later. And you remember that Ahab was killed, and Jezebel, of course, was seized and thrown out of an upper floor window. And the agent for this vengeance was a man named Jehu, who took over as a great military leader. And although he was anointed by Elisha to become the king, but he turned out to be an especially vicious and brutal person. And he quite randomly slaughtered so many people, of course killed the descendants of Ahab, who had a claim to the throne. And he did stamp out, in a very savage manner, the temples of Baal and the worship of Baal. But once he had power, he did not restore the relationship with Judea and the relationship with the temple in Jerusalem, because it might have somehow undermined his power. And as soon as he had this power, he carried it out in this way that power so often corrupts people. If you'll remember, in the temptation on the Mount, Christ 3 times refused power, any kind of earthly power, and kept his lawful authority. And as a revelation to us about Antichrist, that Antichrist would accept these 3 kinds of power. Now, lawful authority can come from God, but power comes from the devil. And as soon as Jehu got power, he couldn't control himself. He couldn't control it. And while he stamped out the worship of Baal, he did not stop from the sins of separation, alienation, keeping the nation split, keeping people perhaps away from going to the temple in Jerusalem because he thought then they might fall under the influence of the king of Judea. And it was Judea that held fast the most often and the most commonly to the faith. And Judea it was that survived until the end, until the dispersion under the Romans. And Judea then became the center for the regathering of Israel in the 20th century. But this still speaks to us a great deal, and on the reasons why we have falling outs, the reasons why we have divisions amongst ourselves. The fact is that in some parishes, because we'll start at the parish level and work upward, there are always a little group of people who want power in the church. And they don't even respect the authority of the bishop or the priest, who have the lawful authority. And they want power, and they want their own way to such a degree that they're willing to cause a split and division in the parish, and don't really care if the people who don't submit to their power and submit to their arrogant and egotistic will, they don't care if they leave the parish and even leave the church altogether, because they have become so intoxicated by their own desire for power and to have their way. And this happens in so many parishes, and when these people have started to try to acquire this power, they actually forget about God. They might use the name God or Jesus Christ or some saint, but in fact, they have no relationship with God or with Jesus Christ, because they want to lord it over their brothers and sisters. They want this complete power, and egotistically they want their own way at any cost. And yet Jesus Christ said, whoever would be first must be last. Whoever would be first must be the servant of all. And we read these verses in the scripture and then pay absolutely no attention to them. And this is one of the great tragedies in human societies and communities, but it's a greater tragedy in the Orthodox Church, because we have and know the truth. But for the sake of power, for the sake of having our own way, for the sake of our own self-will, our own arrogance, our own egotism, we pay no attention to the truth, to Christ, to the teachings of Christ, to the life of Christ, but only desire our own way and our own. And this can happen on a much broader scale, within a jurisdiction, within the whole church. The division, the Great Schism in the universal church, there were many small groups that split away, that went this way and that way, that interpreted for themselves and went off into some sectarianism or even sometimes cultism. But the Great Schism is the one we're interested in, because between Rehoboam and Jeroboam in Israel, the Great Schism in the Holy Nation took place, that was to lead to the destruction of the majority of the tribes and the majority of the population of Israel, of the Holy Land. And when the Great Schism took place, really, people were not trying to negotiate, they were not trying to really heal this division. First of all, we have to say that Rome had fallen into an enormous arrogance. The Bishop of Rome had decided that he had all power on heaven and on earth, and that everyone had to yield to him. And others were saying, well, but some of your teachings are wrong. Some of the things that the Roman Church is teaching are clearly not Orthodox, not even Christian. Things like purgatory and these other things. Well, arrogance, self-will, pride of place, the desire for power, prevented the Roman jurisdiction of the church from really trying to work out the differences with the other jurisdictions, the other patriarchates. And so Rome then sent a bill of excommunication to the whole Eastern Church, and the split came about because of this arrogance, this pompousness, this desire for power, and this egotism. So this affects the church, it affects the parish, it affects the families, it affects us. And because we gain the power does not mean we're going to return to or maintain the faith or unity, as Jehu also did not.